Human Development Indices. Jobs are only created where some value is added. So, for example, when we had the highest oil figures, the highest figures from oil revenues, the highest figures from oil production, we at the same time had the highest levels of poverty. At the same time, the highest levels of debt. At the same time, high levels of unemployment. Because the oil industry by itself, without adding value, does not create jobs and doesn't even create opportunities. So a thriving petrochemical industry, for example, would create jobs directly from oil and gas. The economy, our economy, had also been running on a consumption growth model, which is only advantageous if consumption is being met by domestic production of goods and services. However, our structure was based on consumption of large portions of imports. As long as there was plenty of oil-based foreign exchange in our reserves to import and fuel consumption, our economy kept growing in GDP terms, but few jobs were being created and more people were actually going into poverty. The majority of the affluent, those who are considered affluent in this economic scenario, are the professionals, the financial services intermediaries, banks and bank employees and directors, etc., contractors and others who are able to plug into the rent-seeking opportunities that are created when the biggest business is government-owned. And just to explain that very quickly, those who benefit when there is high oil revenues and there is no real productivity are essentially the service sector, and of course contractors and persons who can find themselves into any of the rent-seeking opportunities presented by high oil prices. Very few other people can profit. So the rich in that situation are persons who have the advantage of knowing people in government who can get contracts. Because government, of course, is always the biggest supplier the biggest supplier of the contracts and of all the opportunities. And that's why at a point in time, somebody commented that we were doing very well as an economy because on one occasion, 35 Nigerians flew in jets into Kenya for a particular ceremony in Kenya, because people had jets, because many people had jets. There was a suggestion up there was some impression created that indeed our country is an affluent country. But the truth of the matter is that underlying the jets, of course, is no productivity whatsoever, because the owners of the jets are contractors and government, friends of those in government. And you could not really tie the ownership of the jets and ownership of these kinds of luxury assets to any kind of productivity. The productive sector, the real manufacturers, the value-adding businesses have always been relatively few. The source of the income coming to this class of individuals, and I refer now to not the manufacturers but for the contractors, is from oil revenue. When oil revenues fall, not only does GDP growth fall, but this most affluent but unproductive sector suffers. Also, in understanding some of the problems of the Nigerian economy, the place of corruption, especially grand corruption, is also crucial. The same oil earnings which are meant to develop infrastructure, to fund education and healthcare, end up in private pockets. The feeding frenzy is worse in times of high oil earnings. A combination of theft of public revenues and the consequent failure to invest in infrastructure, as well as a largely rentier or rent-seeking business class, is what accounts for Nigeria's economic quagmire. The other problem is a problem of extreme poverty. And I think it's important to continue to underscore the fact that our major problem has always been grand corruption, the direct stealing of government resources. I keep emphasizing, every time I emphasize it, there's a headline in the newspaper, Yemi Osinbajo blames previous governments. It's always a headline. But I do not mind repeating it ad nauseum, because it's the truth. And we must not allow it to happen again. And we must not allow it to happen again.